The sun was a hammer on an anvil of bare rock and hard-packed earth, a relentless force that drove all life to seek shelter or perish. Two figures moved through this crucible, their progress a slow and painful testament to a will that refused to be broken. They were sisters, their kinship evident in the similar set of their eyes and the shared rhythm of their movement, even now, at the end of their strength. The air itself was a burden, thick with heat that shimmered above the ground in dizzying waves, distorting the world into a liquid hallucination. The only sounds were the crunch of their worn footwear on the gravel, the labored draw of their breath, and the whisper of their legs brushing through dry, brittle grass. The elder, Chica, moved with a purpose that transcended exhaustion. Her body was a map of their ordeal, a long, shallow scratch down her arm, a layer of fine, pale dust that coated her skin and clothes, turning her dark hair a ghostly gray. But her eyes, dark and sharp, missed nothing. They scanned the horizon not with panic, but with a calculated, weary vigilance. Every few hundred paces, she would stop, holding up a hand to halt her sister, and simply listen. The silence of the desert was a language she understood, and she was listening for a false note, the telltale clink of metal, the distant vibration of hooves, the murmur of voices that did not belong. Each pause was a gamble, costing precious energy and time, but the price of carelessness was unthinkable. The younger sister, Lila, followed in her wake, her steps less certain. Where Chica's exhaustion was a controlled burn, Lila's was a flickering flame, threatening to gut her out. Her face, once bright with a youthful quickness, was now drawn and hollowed by thirst and fear. A faint tremor shook her hands, and she often had to wipe a sleeve across her brow, which did little to clear the sweat and grime. She focused on the back of her sister's shirt, a fixed point in a swimming world, using it as a rope to pull herself forward. The memory of what they were fleeing was a sharp, fresh terror behind her eyes, a chaotic montage of noise and violence that made the vast, empty silence around them feel equally threatening. Their flight had stretched across an eternity of sunrises and sunsets, a journey that had stripped them of everything but the barest essentials of life. They had become creatures of instinct, their world reduced to the search for the next sip of water, the next scrap of food, the next place to hide from the searching eyes they knew were behind them. The landscape they traversed was a brutal tapestry of canyons that swallowed the light and open plains that offered no cover. They traveled by the cool of the night and the dim light of dawn and dusk, hiding during the searing peak of the day in whatever shade they could find, under a rocky overhang, in the narrow shadow of a boulder. It was a life of minute-to-minute survival, a constant calculation of risk and need. Chica's knowledge was their only shield. She knew how to find water where there seemed to be none, spotting the specific clusters of vegetation that hinted at moisture deep underground. She could dig with her hands at the base of a certain rock formation, patiently scraping until the earth turned damp, then waiting for the precious, muddy liquid to seep into the small hole. She knew which insects could be eaten, which roots could be chewed for moisture, and how to move across the land without leaving a clear trail. This knowledge was an inheritance, a quiet wisdom passed down through generations that now formed the thin line between life and death for the two of them. As the afternoon wore on, Lila's strength began to fail her in earnest. Her foot caught on a root hidden in the scrub, and she fell hard onto the stony ground, a small, choked cry escaping her lips. The sound was unnaturally loud in the stillness. In an instant, Chica was kneeling beside her, a hand firmly on her shoulder, her eyes not on her sister, but scanning the terrain behind them, alert for any response to the noise. Her touch was firm, an anchor. Lila squeezed her eyes shut, fighting back tears of frustration and pain. The fall was not just physical. It was a collapse of spirit. Chica did not speak. Instead, she helped Lila to her feet, supporting her weight for a long moment until she was sure the younger woman could stand. From a small, greasy pouch tied at her waist, Chica produced the last piece of dried meat, tough as leather and salty. She pressed it into Lila's hand. The gesture was simple, but it contained a universe of meaning, a shared sacrifice, a promise of shared survival. Lila accepted it with a nod, her eyes meeting her sister's, drawing strength from their unbreakable connection. It was in that moment, as Lila forced herself to chew the tough substance, that Chica's unwavering gaze caught a discrepancy on the western horizon. It was not a shape, but a color. A faint, almost imperceptible smudge of a deeper, richer tone against the washed-out palette of the desert. It was the green of life, of sustained water. It was too regular, too concentrated to be a natural spring or a lucky patch of rain-fed grass. It was the mark of people, of settlement. A complex wave of emotions passed through Chica, a flicker of hope, immediately tempered by a deep and warranted caution. The world of those who lived in such houses had brought them nothing but pain. These were the people whose hunger for land and resources had pushed her people from their homes, whose soldiers now hunted them. To approach such a place was to walk into the lion's den. But the sky was already beginning to change. The brutal white blue was softening at the edges, bleeding into gold and orange along the rim of the world. The long, deep shadows of evening were stretching across the land, and with them would come a cold that was as penetrating and dangerous as the day's heat. They had no blankets, no means to make a fire. To spend the night in the open was to risk exposure, to succumb to a chill that would seep into their bones and slow their hearts. The decision was no decision at all. It was a choice between a certain, slow danger and an uncertain, immediate one. The farm was a gamble, but the night was a certainty. Chica turned to Lila, whose eyes had also seen the distant promise of shelter. The fear was still there, but it was now mixed with a desperate need. Chica pointed, a single, definitive gesture. The path was set. There would be no discussion, no debate. They would go to the farm and ask for sanctuary. It was their only chance. Adjusting the thin strap of her own meager pack, Chica took the first step toward the green smudge on the horizon, her pace deliberate, her mind already working through the possibilities of what they would find, what they would say, how they would present themselves. Lila fell in behind her, the sight of the farm giving her a new, fragile reserve of energy. They walked on, two small, resilient figures against the immense and unforgiving landscape, moving toward a future that was as unknown and threatening as the vast emptiness they left behind. The silence closed in around them again, but now it was filled with the unspoken weight of the choice they had made, a gamble with their very lives as the stake. Each step was heavier than the last, not just with fatigue, but with the burden of hope, a dangerous and fragile thing in a world that had shown them so little kindness. The details of the farm began to resolve slowly as they drew nearer. A simple wooden structure, a house, took shape, and next to it, a larger barn. A fence line demarcated a patch of cultivated land, a startling assertion of order in the wild chaos of the desert. They could see the movement of animals in a corral and the faintest wisp of smoke curling from a chimney. It was a picture of settled life, of permanence, a world away from their own desperate transience. And as they approached the boundary of that ordered world, they felt more exposed than ever, stepping out of the relative anonymity of the wild and into a gaze that could be either merciful or merciless. The fence line they reached was a stark boundary between the wild land they had traversed and the harsh, imposed order of the farm. The posts were uneven, the wire sagging in places, as if the desert were constantly trying to reclaim its own. The green that had beckoned them from a distance revealed itself up close to be a struggling patchwork, a small, muddy vegetable garden, a few stunted fruit trees, and a field of parched grass that served as pasture for a handful of listless cattle. The air, once filled with the dry scent of dust and sage, now carried the pungent smells of manure, wood smoke, and damp earth. The farm itself consisted of two main structures. The house was a single-story cabin built from rough-hewn logs, its windows dark and curtainless. Next to it stood a larger barn, its doors slightly ajar, revealing a cavernous darkness within. The entire place had an air of neglect, of a grim functionality that held no warmth or welcome. As they approached the house, a man emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. He was tall and raw-boned, with shoulders that stooped slightly from years of labor. His face was weathered and lined, etched with the solitude of his existence. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy that spoke of a deep-seated weariness. This was Jack Barton. He stopped short at the sight of them, his eyes narrowing. His gaze was not one of surprise at seeing people, but of cold assessment, like a man inspecting stray animals that had wandered onto his property. He took in their disheveled appearance, their Apache clothing, their evident exhaustion, and his expression did not soften into pity. It hardened into a mask of calculation. Chica stepped forward, her posture straightening despite her fatigue. She positioned herself slightly in front of Lila, a protective gesture that was not lost on the farmer. She began to speak, her voice low and measured, the English words foreign on her tongue, but delivered with a quiet dignity. She explained their situation in sparse terms. They were travelers. They needed shelter for the night, water, a place to rest away from the open country. She did not mention the soldiers, but the urgency in her eyes, the occasional involuntary glance back the way they had come, told their own story. Jack Barton listened in silence, his arms crossed over his chest. He did not offer water or a place to sit. His eyes traveled from Chica's determined face to Lila's frightened one, lingering on the younger sister with a possessiveness that made Lila shrink back. He was a man who had known only lack, and here before him was something he had not possessed. The silence stretched out, becoming heavy and oppressive. The sounds of the farm, the lowing of a cow, the rustle of the dry grass in the wind, seemed to amplify the tension. He was weighing their desperation against his own desires, and the scales were tipping in a predictable direction. Finally, a slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. It did not reach his eyes. He delivered his ultimatum, the words crude and blunt, hanging in the air between them. The price of sanctuary was not money or labor, but their very selves. The proposition was not a request, it was a transaction, one where he held all the power. Lila's breath caught in her throat. A hot flush of shame and anger rose to her cheeks. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, and she took a half step forward, a protest forming on her lips. But Chica's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with a force that was both a warning and a restraint. Chica's own face became an unreadable mask. She did not look at Lila. Her entire focus was on the farmer, on the cold certainty in his eyes. She knew that a refusal meant being cast back out into the gathering dusk, into the path of their pursuers. It was a choice between two forms of capture. Her mind worked with a swift, cold clarity. To accept was unthinkable. To refuse was fatal. But acceptance could be a tactic, a way to cross the threshold and buy time. She could see the dust cloud of the cavalry on the distant horizon, a smudge of impending danger. The farmer's farm was a sanctuary precisely because of its owner's rough reputation. The soldiers would not trouble him. This man's vile offer was, perversely, their only shield. She gave a single, sharp nod. It was not a nod of submission, but one of grim necessity. The deal was struck. A gate in the fence was unlatched, and they were ushered not into a place of safety, but into a new kind of prison. The room he led them to was a small, square space at the back of the cabin, clearly used for storage. It smelled of dust, dried herbs, and old wood. A single narrow cot with a thin, stained mattress was pushed against one wall. A bare wooden chair and a small chest were the only other furnishings. A single small window, set high in the wall, offered a view of the darkening sky and the silhouette of the barn. Jack Barton left them there with a curt instruction to make themselves presentable, sliding a heavy wooden bar across the door on the outside. The sound was final, a definitive click that sealed their fate. They were locked in. For a long moment, neither sister moved. The reality of their situation settled upon them like a physical weight. Lila stood frozen in the center of the room, trembling from a mixture of rage, fear, and humiliation. The tears she had held back now streamed down her face, silent and hot. She wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to hold her body together. Chica, however, did not succumb to despair. The moment the bars slid into place, a change came over her. The mask of passive acceptance fell away, replaced by the focused intensity of a strategist. She crossed the door, running her fingers along the crack where it met the jamb, testing its strength. She then moved to the window, standing on the chest to examine its latch and frame. It was too small for escape, but it was an eye to the outside world. She turned to Lila, her expression stern but not unkind. She moved to her sister's side and placed her hands on her shoulders, forcing Lila to meet her gaze. There were no words of empty comfort. Instead, Chica spoke in a low, urgent whisper, her voice barely audible. She laid out the truth of their situation with brutal clarity. They were in a wolf's den, but the wolf was overconfident. He saw them as frightened girls, as property he had acquired. That was his weakness. They would play the part he expected, but only until the moment was right. They would use his expectation of submission against him. They were not victims waiting for their fate. They were warriors in a cage, waiting for an opportunity. As darkness fell completely, blanketing the room in deep shadows, Chica began a systematic search of their prison. Her hands moved over the walls, tapping for hollow spots. She examined the chest, finding it empty. Then, on her hands and knees, she felt along the rough-hewn floorboards. Near the cot, her fingers found what she was looking for, a board that was slightly looser than the others. Working patiently, she managed to pry it up. In the cavity beneath, wrapped in an old piece of oilcloth, was a long, sharp hunting knife. It was not a beautiful weapon, but it was well cared for, its edge honed to a deadly sharpness. It was a tool of survival hidden away, and now it was theirs. It felt heavy and cold in her hand, a tangible promise of resistance. Meanwhile, Lila, following her sister's lead, took up a post at the window. She watched the outside world. She saw the farmer leave the house and walk toward the barn, a lantern swinging in his hand. And then, further out beyond the fence line, she saw the pinpricks of light, campfires. The cavalry had made camp for the night. They were close, but they were keeping their distance. There was an unspoken understanding here. This farm was Jack Barton's territory, and the soldiers would not intrude. This realization added another layer to their predicament. Their escape would have to be silent, unseen. They could not simply run into the night, for they would run straight into the arms of their other enemies. They had to disappear without a trace. The plan began to form in the stifling darkness of the room, a plan born of desperation and a fierce, unyielding will to live. They would wait. They would be ready. The wait felt like an eternity, measured in the slow crawl of shadows across the moonlit floor and the frantic beating of their own hearts. The sounds from the main room of the house told a story of their own. The heavy tread of boots, the clink of a bottle, the occasional low mutter. Jack Barton was drinking, fortifying himself for what he considered his wedding night. His overconfidence was a palpable force, seeping under the door of their room. Finally, the heavy tread approached. The bar on the door scraped as it was lifted. The door swung open, framing the farmer in the doorway. He filled the space, a large, looming silhouette backlit by the lamplight from the main room. The smell of cheap whiskey and sweat rolled off him. He stood there for a moment, his eyes adjusting to the dimness, a smug, possessive smile on his face. He expected to see fear cowering submission. He saw, instead, two figures standing together near the cot. Chica was slightly in front, her posture not defiant, but unerringly still. Lila was behind her, half hidden in the shadow. The scene was not what he had anticipated. A flicker of confusion passed over his features, quickly replaced by irritation. He took a step into the room, his voice a low growl, demanding the compliance he had purchased. This was the moment. As he moved forward, his balance slightly compromised by drink, Chica acted. It was not a wild, emotional lunge, but a swift, precise movement. The hunting knife, which she had held hidden against her leg, flashed in the weak light. She did not aim to kill. A dead man on his property would bring immediate, unwelcome investigation. Instead, she targeted his dominant arm, slashing downward across his forearm in a deep, sharp cut. The pain was instantaneous and shocking. He roared, more in surprise and fury than agony, staring at the dark blood welling from the wound. The controlled stillness of the room erupted into chaos. Jack, enraged, lunged at Chica with his good arm. But the sisters had a plan, and they moved like parts of a single organism. As Chica ducked under his grasp, Lila sprang into action. She did not attack him directly. Instead, she became an agent of chaos. She grabbed the wooden chair and threw it into his path. She upended the small chest, scattering its contents across the floor. She screamed, not a scream of terror, but a sharp, piercing cry designed to disorient and confuse. The confined space, now cluttered with obstacles and filled with noise, worked against the larger, clumsier man. Chica used the environment to her advantage. She moved like a shadow, using the cot for cover, striking out with the knife not to inflict mortal wounds, but to harass and disable. A shallow cut on his leg, a slash across his shoulder when he turned to confront Lila. It was a battle of attrition, fought in a space no larger than a stall. Jack Barton was strong, but he was slow, drunk, and bleeding. He was fighting two opponents who knew each other's thoughts, who used the element of surprise and the terrain itself as weapons. He swung a wild fist, catching Chica on the side of the head and sending her stumbling against the wall. But as he focused on her, Lila grabbed the lantern from a hallway and threw it, not at him, but at the wall behind him. The glass shattered and oil splattered, the flame licking hungrily at the dry wood for a moment before dying out. But the act added another layer of shock. The fight was brutal and short. Blinded by rage and pain, Jack made a final charge toward Chica. As he did, she sidestepped, and Lila shoved the overturned cot into his path. He tripped, falling heavily against the doorframe. In that moment of imbalance, Chica brought the heavy handle of the knife down on the back of his head with a sickening thud. He collapsed onto the floor, unconscious, his breathing a ragged, wet sound. The sisters stood panting in the sudden quiet, the air thick with the smell of blood, whiskey, and smoke. They had won the battle for the room, but the war for their freedom was just beginning. They had to move quickly. Using a length of rope they found in the hallway, they bound his hands and feet tightly. Then, with a tremendous effort, they dragged his dead weight out of the room, down a short corridor, and heaved him down the steep, rough stairs into the dark, earthy-smelling cellar. They slammed the heavy door shut, dropping a thick wooden plank into the brackets, imprisoning their would-be captor. The house was now theirs, but it was a temporary and precarious victory. The silence that descended after locking the cellar door was more terrifying than the noise of the struggle. It was a fragile, pregnant silence, waiting to be shattered. Adrenaline still coursed through their veins, making their hands shake. Chica's head throbbed where she had been struck, and a trickle of blood ran down her temple. Lila's arms ached from the effort of dragging the man. But there was no time to tend to their wounds. They stood in the main room of the cabin, listening. Outside, the world was still. The cavalry campfires still glowed in the distance. Inside, from behind the cellar door, came a low, muffled groan. Jack Barton was regaining consciousness. Their time was measured in minutes. Chica's mind raced. They could not simply flee on foot. They would be exhausted, slow, and easily tracked. They needed horses. But the horses were in the corral near the barn, in plain sight of the soldiers' camp. To take them would create noise and movement that would surely be seen. They needed a diversion, something to draw every eye away from a farmstead. Her eyes fell on the barn. It was filled with dry hay, with straw, with everything that would burn like tinder. Fire. It was the oldest and most effective distraction. It was also the most dangerous, a force that could easily turn on them. But they had no other choice. They moved with a new, frantic purpose. They ransacked the cabin quickly, efficiently. They found a small stash of jerky and hardtack, which they stuffed into a burlap sack. They filled a canteen with water from a bucket. Then they slipped out the front door, keeping to the deep shadows cast by the house. The cool night air was a shock after the close, violent heat of the room. They could hear the farmer now, his shouts muffled by the cellar door, but growing louder. He was kicking against the wood, a dull, rhythmic pounding that seemed to echo across the yard. Staying low, they scurried to the barn. The smell of animals and hay was strong. Inside it was pitch black, but their eyes adjusted. They could hear the soft snuffling and shifting of the horses in their stalls. Chica went to work immediately. She piled dry hay against the rear wall of the barn, the side farthest from the house and closest to the open plains. She created a small, loose pile that would catch quickly and burn fast. Lila stood guard at the door, her heart hammering against her ribs, watching the distant campfires and listening to the increasingly frantic sounds from the cellar. With a deep breath, Chica struck a match she had found in the cabin. The flare was blinding in the darkness. She touched it to the hay. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, a tiny flame caught, licked at a strand of hay, and began to spread with terrifying speed. It climbed the dry wall, crackling and popping, growing from a small fire into a raging inferno in a matter of seconds. The light was intense, painting the interior of the barn in flickering oranges and reds. The horses began to whinny in panic, stamping their feet. They did not wait to watch. As the fire took hold, roaring into the night sky, they ran to the corral. The scene outside was one of incipient chaos. From the soldiers' camp, shouts of alarm rose. Men were pointing, running. The fire was a beacon, pulling all attention toward the barn. In the corral, the horses were spooked, milling about nervously. Chica and Lila moved among them, speaking in low, calming tones. They selected two of the strongest-looking animals, horses used to hard work, not speed, but they would have to do. With practiced ease born of a life around horses, they fashioned makeshift bridles from ropes they found hanging on the fence. There was no time for saddles. As they swung onto the bare backs of the horses, the barn was fully engulfed, a tower of flame that lit up the entire valley. The shouts from the soldiers' camp were closer now. Men were mounting up, not to give chase to two fleeing figures, but to ride to the farm to contain the blaze, to prevent it from spreading to the dry grassland. The sisters dug their heels into the horses' flanks and urged them away from the light, away from the shouts, away from the pounding on the cellar door. They rode not toward the road, but straight out into the open, trackless darkness of the plain, the fire at their backs a brilliant, destructive shield covering their escape. They rode until the fire was nothing but a faint orange glow on the horizon, a dying star in a vast black sky. They rode until the shouts and the chaos were swallowed by the immense silence of the night. They rode until the horses' lathered sides heaved and their own bodies screamed for rest. Only then, as the first faint hint of gray touched the eastern sky, did they allow the animals to slow to a walk and then to stop in a shallow wash sheltered by a low ridge. The adrenaline that had sustained them drained away, leaving them hollow and trembling. They slid from the horses' backs, their legs buckling beneath them. They tended to the animals first, a deeply ingrained instinct of gratitude and survival. They rubbed them down with handfuls of dry grass, allowed them to drink sparingly from the canteen, and tethered them where they could graze on the sparse vegetation. Then, and only then, did they collapse onto the ground, their backs against the cool earth of the ridge. Dawn broke slowly, painting the sky in soft pastels of pink and gold. The desert, which had been so brutal and hostile the day before, was now breathtakingly beautiful, a landscape of pure, clean light and long, soft shadows. As the sun crested the ridge, its warm rays touched their faces. Lila looked at her sister. The fear was gone from her eyes. In its place was a profound exhaustion, but also a new hardness, a resilience that had been forged in the crucible of the night. She saw the cut on Chica's temple, the bruises already forming on her arms, and she reached out a hand to touch them, a silent acknowledgement of what they had endured together. Chica met her gaze. There was no smile, but a deep, weary satisfaction. They had done it. They had faced degradation and violence and had not broken. They had turned their captor's greed against him, using his own tools to secure their freedom. They had walked into a trap and had fought their way out not as victims, but as equals in a brutal contest of wills. The flight from the soldiers was no longer a frantic scramble for survival. It had become a purposeful journey. They were no longer just fleeing from something. They were moving toward something, even if they did not yet know what it was. They shared the jerky and water, the simple meal tasting like a feast. Chica stood up, scanning the horizon with the same keen eyes she had used the previous day. But now the search was different. She was not looking for a refuge granted by others. She was looking for a path of their own choosing. The flat, open lands to the south, the way they had originally intended to go to reunite with their people, now seemed too predictable, too exposed. Instead, she turned her gaze to the west, where the land rose into broken hills and canyons, a more difficult and complex terrain that offered concealment and mystery. She pointed westward. Lila nodded, a firm, decisive gesture. There were no words. They had passed beyond the need for constant discussion. They mounted the horses once more, their bodies sore, but their spirits lighter. They turned their backs on the rising sun and urged the horses into a steady trot, heading not for a known destination, but into the promise of an unknown future. They were two women on stolen horses, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the will in their hearts. But they were free, and as they rode into the vastness of the morning, the shadows of the previous night fell away behind them, lost in the brilliant, unforgiving light of a new day.